The routine click of the security door echoed through the visitation hall of the Northwood Correctional Facility in Mansfield, Ohio, a sound synonymous with temporary connection, until the screams began. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile glow on the worn plastic chairs bolted to the floor, and the small laminate-topped tables separating inmates from their visitors. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, October 17th, the air hung heavy with the usual low murmur of conversation. Snippets of lives outside the gray walls, updates on children, shared worries about bills, mundane details made precious by separation. This fragile semblance of normalcy shattered just after 2:30 p.m. A sudden, violent commotion erupted from one of the tables near the far wall. A woman's cry, sharp with terror, cut through the drone. Immediately, guards moved towards the sound, their movements efficient, trained for disturbance, but perhaps not for this. The scene unfolding was one of swift, brutal chaos. A man, identified later as inmate David Miller, was attacking his visitor, his wife Sarah Miller. The weapon was improvised, something sharp and readily available in the restricted environment. Though initially obscured by the struggle, other visitors recoiled, pulling children close, scrambling away from the epicenter of the violence. The low buzz of conversation died instantly, replaced by gasps, frightened whispers, and the urgent shouts of correctional officers. The attack was swift, vicious. Sarah Miller slumped forward, a crimson stain blooming rapidly across her chest, soaking into the fabric of her simple blouse. David Miller was quickly subdued by the converging guards, wrestled away from his critically injured wife. He offered little resistance once separated, his face a mask of cold fury or shock, details that would be debated endlessly later. The visitation hall became a tableau of horror. The injured woman, the restraining guards, the terrified onlookers, the chilling silence that fell once the physical struggle ceased. This was not a typical prison fight. This was an inmate turning on the person who had come voluntarily into this controlled environment to see him. The violation felt profound, extending beyond the physical act to the very nature of the relationship that had brought them together in this room. Emergency medical personnel were immediately called to the scene, rushing against the clock into the secured area. They worked feverishly, but the injuries were catastrophic. On the cold floor of the visitation hall, surrounded by the hushed panic of guards and the distant wail of sirens approaching the facility, Sarah Miller's life ended. The time of death was logged officially later, but for all present it was clear she was gone before she could be moved. The Northwood Correctional Facility, a structure built to contain men separated from society, had just become the site of a murder. A place of planned, intimate violence rather than contained, public punishment. The immediate aftermath was a blur of activity under strict protocol. The hall was cleared of all other visitors, their visits abruptly terminated, ushered out with a mixture of fear and confusion etched on their faces. The area around Table 7 where the attack occurred was immediately cordoned off with temporary barriers, awaiting forensic processing. David Miller was taken into solitary confinement, isolated from the general population in the shockwaves of his actions. The news spread quickly through the facility grapevine. An inmate killed his wife during visitation. The motive was unclear to most initially, but the sheer audacity and location of the crime guaranteed its rapid dissemination, first within the walls, then inevitably beyond them. Investigators from the Ohio State Highway Patrol, the primary law enforcement agency involved in major incidents at state facilities, were summoned, along with the Mansfield Police Department, as a liaison to the community side of the investigation. A crime scene unit was dispatched. The grim work began, documenting the scene, collecting potential evidence, identifying witnesses among the correctional staff and remaining inmates in the vicinity. The silence in the visitation hall after the body was removed was surgical, broken only by the methodical clicks of crime scene photographers. The air still held the metallic scent of blood, a stark contrast to the earlier smell of cheap coffee and stale air. The visitation badge Sarah Miller had worn, her temporary permit to enter this world, lay discarded near the table, a small, pathetic symbol of a visit that ended in death. Outside the prison walls, in the quiet, tree-lined streets of Mansfield, news of the incident would soon begin to filter out, first as rumor, then as confirmed tragedy, shaking the perception of safety even within a controlled environment. The question hung heavy in the air, unspoken but palpable. Why? What could possibly drive a man, already incarcerated, to commit such a final devastating act against the person who seemingly remained loyal to him? The investigation into the death of Sarah Miller had just begun, starting with the chilling tableau left behind on the floor of the Northwood Correctional Facility Visitation Hall. Sarah Elizabeth Miller, née Thompson, was 30. Her life had been centered in the quiet, working-class neighborhoods of Mansfield and the surrounding Richland County area. She worked as a medical assistant at a local clinic, a job she held for several years. Known by colleagues as reliable, quiet, and kind, her daily routine had been one of modest predictability: work, home, caring for her small rented house, and maintaining a connection with her husband David. Despite his incarceration, she had married David Miller 3 years prior, after he had already been sentenced to a term for aggravated robbery. It was a relationship that had raised eyebrows among some who knew her. Marrying a man already serving time seemed unconventional, perhaps even foolish to outsiders. Yet Sarah had appeared committed. She made the regular trips to the Northwood facility for visitation, accepted collect calls and wrote letters. She projected an image of steadfast loyalty, navigating the unique challenges of a relationship conducted through glass partitions and over crackling phone lines. Her family, though supportive, held reservations. Sarah was close to her mother, Linda Thompson, who lived just a few miles away. Her stepfather, Thomas Jenkins, had been part of her life since she was a teenager. Marrying Linda after Sarah's biological father had left, Thomas was a fixture in their small family unit, a quiet, unassuming man who worked at a local factory. Sarah had always seemed to have a good relationship with him, characterized by mutual respect and the easy familiarity that comes from years of shared family holidays and quiet evenings. There was no outward indication of tension or conflict within this core family group. Sarah's world was relatively small, her circle of friends tight-knit but not extensive. She wasn't one for large social gatherings, preferring quiet evenings or small dinners. Her colleagues at the clinic remembered her as dedicated but reserved, someone who kept her personal life largely private. She talked about David sometimes, commented one coworker during initial interviews with investigators, requesting anonymity. Said it was hard, but she was sticking by him. Never complained, just seemed resigned to it, I guess. This public face of quiet resilience and unwavering support for her incarcerated husband was the only one most people saw. There was no hint of any secret life, no whispers of infidelity, no signs of distress that might suggest she was carrying a hidden burden. Her visits to David were consistent, scheduled appointments in a structured environment, part of the approved routine of prison life. She followed protocol, arrived on time, and appeared to the correctional staff who observed countless interactions daily. Like any other visitor, maintaining a connection with an incarcerated loved one. Her car, a modest sedan, was always parked in the designated visitor lot. She passed through security, received her temporary badge, and waited patiently for her husband to be brought to the visitation room. It was a mundane ritual, repeated countless times by thousands of families across the country. The last few weeks leading up to October 17th seemed outwardly normal. Phone records reviewed later showed regular calls between Sarah and David, typical conversations covering everyday topics, plans for her visit, expressions of affection. Letters exchanged through the prison mail system also appeared routine on initial inspection, containing personal updates and reassurances. There was no obvious shift in tone, no sudden signs of conflict embedded within these communications that would signal the imminent tragedy. However, investigators knew that surface appearances could be misleading, particularly when secrets were involved. The sheer brutality of the attack suggested a powerful immediate trigger, something that ignited a sudden, uncontrollable rage. It was unlikely to be a slow build of generic marital tension. It felt personal, specific, and intensely volatile. The timeline of Sarah's last known activities was meticulously reconstructed. Work on Monday, home in the evening, a brief phone call with her mother, preparations for the Tuesday visit. Everything appeared normal until she stepped into the visitation room at Northwood. The discrepancy between her seemingly stable, predictable life and the horrific violence of her death was profound. This quiet woman, known for her reserved nature and unwavering support for her incarcerated husband, had become the victim of an act of rage so extreme it defied the controlled environment in which it occurred. The investigation needed to look beyond the surface of her life, to find the hidden currents and buried truths that could explain why her final visit ended not with a goodbye, but with murder. David Miller was 35 years old at the time of the incident. He had been an inmate at Northwood Correctional Facility for 3 years, serving a sentence of 7 to 10 years for aggravated robbery. His criminal history was not extensive prior to that, consisting primarily of petty theft and probation violations. The aggravated robbery conviction stemmed from a desperate, ill-conceived attempt to hold up a convenience store, a crime fueled by debt and substance abuse, according to his defense attorney at the time. He had been apprehended quickly and had offered little resistance to arresting officers. Inside Northwood, David was considered a moderately compliant inmate. He was not a frequent disciplinary problem, kept to himself for the most part, and participated in some basic educational programs. He had a small group of fellow inmates he associated with but was not a leader or part of any known prison gang. His relationship with Sarah began before his arrest but deepened during the initial period of his incarceration. Letters and phone calls became the primary means of connection. To correctional staff, their relationship seemed standard for a committed couple dealing with separation due to imprisonment. Sarah's regular visits were noted in his file, a positive factor generally encouraged by the system, as maintaining outside ties is often seen as beneficial for rehabilitation. However, the dynamics of relationships maintained under the conditions of incarceration are inherently complex. Communication is filtered, limited, and often strained. The pressures on the person on the outside are immense, balancing their own life with the demands and emotional weight of supporting an incarcerated partner. For the inmate, the isolation and loss of control can breed resentment, suspicion, and an intense focus on the outside world they are denied. David Miller's perspective on his relationship with Sarah while in prison was a crucial, if initially difficult, area of investigation. His communications were monitored, as is standard procedure. Phone calls were recorded, and letters were read by prison staff. These records provided a partial window into their interactions. Early communications were often filled with expressions of affection, discussions about the future, and the mundane details of Sarah's life outside. David frequently expressed gratitude for her support and professed his love. There was nothing in these early communications to suggest deep-seated issues that would lead to violence. However, as time went on, subtle shifts could be perceived upon review. Some conversations contained hints of frustration or jealousy on David's part, common feelings for incarcerated individuals. He would ask detailed questions about her day, her interactions with others, particularly men. Sarah's responses, based on the transcripts, were consistently reassuring, emphasizing her focus on him and their future. On the surface, it appeared he accepted her reassurances, but beneath the surface, questions about trust and fidelity festered, amplified by his isolation and inability to verify her life outside. His interactions with other inmates provided another layer. While he wasn't deeply embedded in the prison's social structure, conversations with those he did speak to could influence his perception. Information, or misinformation, traveled quickly and often distortedly within the prison walls. Rumors, gossip, and the skewed perspectives of other inmates could easily plant seeds of doubt. David's own psychological state while incarcerated was also a factor. The monotony, the stress, the lack of control, and the separation from loved ones could exacerbate existing insecurities or create new ones. While he had no recorded history of significant mental illness within the prison system, the conditions themselves are known to impact psychological well-being. The motive for the attack remained the central puzzle immediately following the incident. Why kill the person who was seemingly his most dedicated supporter? It contradicted the typical pattern of prison violence, which usually involved conflicts between inmates or directed at staff. This was deeply personal, an act of domestic violence transplanted into the sterile environment of a correctional facility. Investigators theorized it had to be something Sarah said or did, or something David had learned recently, that provoked such an extreme reaction. The content of their final conversations, the letters exchanged, and any information David might have received from outside sources or other inmates, became the immediate focus. The narrative of the devoted wife waiting for her husband was suddenly complicated by the reality of her violent death at his hands. The search began for the hidden catalyst, the secret that tore apart their relationship and led to murder within the very walls, meant to separate him from the outside world, yet which ultimately contained his final devastating act against it. The catalyst for the violence, the secret that proved fatal, began to emerge in the hours and days following the incident. It was not a gradual erosion of trust, but a sudden, explosive revelation that David Miller claimed he received shortly before Sarah's final visit on October 2nd. Initial interviews with David, conducted under strict security protocols, were difficult. He was emotionally volatile, alternating between fits of rage and periods of chilling calm. His account, though fragmented and fueled by intense emotion, centered on a specific piece of information he said he had just learned. According to Miller, he had discovered that Sarah had been engaged in a sexual relationship with her stepfather, Thomas Jenkins. This information, he insisted, had been relayed to him only recently. The source of this information was initially unclear, adding a layer of complexity to his claim. Was it from a letter? A phone call? Another inmate who had heard something from the outside? The timing was critical. Miller claimed he learned this secret just days before the visit, during which he then committed the murder. This aligns with the investigators' theory of a sudden, immediate trigger rather than a long simmering issue. The impact of this alleged revelation on David Miller was, by his account and the evidence of his actions, profound and immediate. He described feeling betrayed, humiliated, and consumed by rage. The man he trusted with his wife, the man who was part of her family, was allegedly engaged in a relationship with her. The violation in his mind was absolute. This narrative of discovery and immediate violent reaction became the cornerstone of David Miller's explanation for his actions. It provided a motive, however disturbing, for the murder, but investigators could not simply accept his claim at face value. They needed to corroborate it, to understand how he learned the information, and to determine if the alleged affair was real. The focus of the investigation immediately expanded beyond the prison walls to include Sarah's life and her relationships, particularly with Thomas Jenkins. Thomas Jenkins, a man in his late 50s, was brought in for questioning. His initial demeanor was one of shock and grief over Sarah's death. He expressed disbelief and horror at David Miller's actions. When questioned about David Miller's claim of an affair, Jenkins vehemently denied it. He portrayed his relationship with Sarah as purely familial, that of a stepfather and stepdaughter. He described Sarah as a beloved member of his family, a good person, and spoke of his close relationship with her mother, Linda. His denial was firm, but investigators knew that secrets could be deeply buried, especially those involving family and potential infidelity. The information David Miller claimed to have received was potentially devastating not just to his marriage, but to Sarah's family as a whole. The source of the information David received was also critical. If it came from another inmate, that inmate would need to be identified and questioned. If it came through monitored communications, the records would need to be meticulously reviewed for any hint of this secret or its transmission. If it came from an outside source, that source needed to be found. Unpacking this complex web of relationships, secrets, and the alleged revelation became the central task for investigators. Was David Miller's claim the truth, the tragic explanation for his sudden, violent act? Or was it a fabricated excuse, born of some other rage or delusion? The answer lay hidden in the details of Sarah's life, her relationship with her stepfather, and the communications that flowed, however restricted, into the Northwood Correctional Facility. The truth investigators suspected was likely more complicated and more painful than any simple explanation. The truth investigators suspected was more complicated and more painful than any simple explanation. The alleged affair between Sarah Miller and her stepfather, Thomas Jenkins, became the focal point of the investigation. The claim, made by David Miller, was explosive, and if true, provided a powerful motive for his actions. Investigators meticulously reviewed Sarah's life for any evidence supporting David's assertion. This involved interviewing family members, friends, coworkers, and neighbors, looking for any hint of an inappropriate relationship between Sarah and Thomas. Coworkers at the clinic described Sarah as private, offering no insight into her relationship with her stepfather beyond typical family mentions. Friends painted a similar picture. Sarah spoke of her mother and stepfather in normal terms, discussing family dinners, holidays, and occasional help with household tasks. No one reported seeing anything unusual or suggestive in the interactions between Sarah and Thomas, or heard Sarah express any feelings for him beyond familial affection. The initial interviews with Sarah's mother, Linda Thompson, were understandably fraught with grief and shock. She struggled to comprehend David's actions and the horrific manner of her daughter's death. When gently questioned about David's claim regarding Thomas, Linda was devastated and indignant. She staunchly defended her husband, describing their marriage as loving and stable, and her relationship with Sarah as close and open. She maintained that there was no truth whatsoever to the accusation of an affair between Sarah and Thomas. Her emotional reaction appeared genuine to investigators. The idea seemed abhorrent to her. Thomas Jenkins continued to deny any inappropriate relationship with Sarah. His account of his relationship with his stepdaughter was consistent with a typical healthy familial bond. He spoke of watching her grow up, being proud of her accomplishments, and supporting her, including her decision to marry David. He expressed deep sorrow over her death and outrage at David Miller's accusation, which he characterized as a desperate and malicious lie. Digging deeper, investigators examined phone records and electronic communications between Sarah and Thomas, seeking any pattern of contact that seemed excessive or secretive for a stepfather-stepdaughter relationship. The records showed regular calls and texts, but these were mostly during reasonable hours, often related to family matters or checking in on each other. There was nothing immediately apparent in the frequency or timing of these communications that screamed affair. Financial records were also reviewed, looking for any unusual transfers of money or joint accounts, but none were found. The physical distance between their homes was also considered. While they lived in the same general area of Mansfield, they did not live together, making a sustained, hidden affair more challenging logistically, though certainly not impossible. The investigation then turned back to David Miller and how he allegedly received this information. Prison communication logs became paramount. Every recorded phone call, every piece of incoming and outgoing mail associated with David Miller for the weeks leading up to October 17th was painstakingly reviewed. The breakthrough came not from a direct statement from Sarah, but from an indirect source, corroborating David's claim of how he learned the information, even if the veracity of the information itself remained uncertain. The review of inmate communications revealed that David Miller had received a letter from an individual on the outside, a former acquaintance of Sarah's who had served time with David in the past. This letter, intercepted and read by prison staff as part of routine security measures, contained the damaging accusation. The acquaintance claimed he had heard rumors about Sarah and her stepfather from mutual contacts outside. The letter detailed these rumors, presenting them as fact. The date stamp on this letter showed it arrived at the facility and was processed just 2 days before Sarah's fatal visit. This discovery was critical. It confirmed David Miller's timeline for learning the information and provided a plausible source, albeit one based on rumor and possibly unreliable information. It also explained why Sarah's own communications with David might not have contained any direct reference to the alleged affair. She may have been unaware he had received this information, or simply did not address it in their monitored calls and letters. The revelation amplified the tragedy, suggesting that the killing might have been triggered by unverified gossip filtering into the highly charged environment of the prison. With the source identified, investigators now had to assess its credibility. Was the acquaintance telling the truth, relaying accurate information, or was he malicious, misinformed, or seeking to cause trouble? The investigation widened further, seeking out the source of the rumors themselves. The picture emerging was one of devastating consequence, stemming from information received secondhand, information that ignited a firestorm of rage within David Miller, culminating in the brutal act in the Visitation Hall. The secret, whether real or perceived, had cost Sarah Miller her life, with the alleged source of David Miller's information identified as a letter from a former acquaintance relaying rumors. The investigation shifted to validating or refuting the claim of an affair, and understanding the chain of information. The acquaintance who sent the letter, identified as Mark Reynolds, was located and interviewed. Reynolds confirmed sending the letter to Miller. He claimed he had heard talk around town in Mansfield about Sarah and her stepfather. He didn't have direct knowledge or proof, he admitted, but he thought David deserved to know. He described the rumors as circulating within a specific, somewhat insular social group that included people known to Sarah and her family. Reynolds' credibility was assessed. He had a minor criminal history and was known to engage in gossip, but he did not appear to have a direct motive to fabricate the story entirely, other than perhaps a misguided sense of loyalty to Miller, or simply a penchant for spreading salacious information. His account suggested the rumors existed, even if their basis in fact was questionable. Investigators then began the difficult process of tracking down the alleged mutual contacts who were supposedly the source of these rumors. This required discreet interviews within the community, navigating sensitive family dynamics and the desire for privacy following Sarah's highly public death. Several individuals interviewed confirmed hearing whispers or speculation about Sarah and Thomas Jenkins. The details were vague and varied, often framed as something just didn't seem right, or they seemed unusually close. No one could offer concrete evidence such as having witnessed an explicit interaction, possessing incriminating messages, or knowing someone with direct knowledge. The rumors appeared to be just that: speculation, fueled by observation, or perhaps misinterpretation, of normal interactions within a blended family. The pattern of contact between Sarah and Thomas, reviewed again, did not deviate significantly from a normal family relationship. Their phone calls were typically brief, often initiated by Linda, or related to family matters. Texts were mundane, coordinating visits, asking about each other's day, sharing family news. There were no hidden numbers, no coded language, nothing overtly suspicious in the volume or content of their communication records that suggested a secret relationship. Forensic examination of Sarah's electronic devices, with consent from her mother, also yielded no definitive proof of an affair. Her phone, computer, and social media accounts showed regular contact with Thomas and Linda, but no intimate messages or communications directed solely to Thomas that were outside the bounds of a familial relationship. This lack of concrete evidence supporting the affair claim was significant. While it didn't definitively prove the affair didn't happen, it strongly suggested that David Miller's information was based on rumor and not verifiable fact. This raised profound questions about the nature of his rage. Was it triggered by a perceived betrayal, regardless of its truth, or was the rumor itself maliciously planted, intended to cause harm? Meanwhile, forensic processing of the visitation hall scene continued. The weapon used in the attack was recovered. A sharpened piece of metal, likely smuggled out of the prison workshop or another area where inmates had access to materials. Its presence in the visitation hall was a security breach, raising questions about how Miller obtained and concealed it. The sheer number of stab wounds inflicted on Sarah indicated an intensity of rage far exceeding what might be expected from a less personal conflict. The medical examiner's report detailed the nature and extent of the injuries, confirming the brutality of the attack. David Miller's psychological state became a key factor in the legal proceedings. His defense attorney argued that Miller was suffering from extreme emotional disturbance at the time of the crime, provoked by the information he received. They contended that his perception of Sarah's betrayal, whether true or false, was real to him and drove him to a temporary state of madness. The prosecution, however, viewed the act as premeditated murder. They argued that the weapon had to have been acquired and concealed beforehand, indicating planning. They contended that his rage, while perhaps fueled by the rumor, was a conscious response, not an uncontrollable act of madness. The lack of concrete evidence for the affair complicated both arguments. If the affair was real, it provided a direct, albeit disturbing, motive for passion. If it was false, it painted a picture of a man prone to violence based on unfounded rumors, potentially strengthening the prosecution's case for premeditation, or at least mitigating the defense's claim of provocation. The legal battle lines were drawn, centering on the truth of a rumor and its devastating impact. The legal proceedings against David Miller commenced in the Richland County Court of Common Pleas in Mansfield. He was formally charged with aggravated murder, due to the high-profile nature of the case, occurring within a state correctional facility, and the disturbing details. It garnered significant local media attention. The defense team, appointed by the court, immediately focused on the narrative of extreme emotional disturbance. Their strategy was to argue that David Miller's actions, while undeniably tragic, were a direct result of the sudden overwhelming shock and rage he experienced upon learning of his wife's alleged affair with her stepfather. They presented evidence of the letter received by Miller containing the rumor, arguing that regardless of the rumor's truth, Miller believed it implicitly and it shattered his perception of his marriage and Sarah's loyalty. Expert psychological testimony was prepared to explain how the isolation of prison, combined with a perceived betrayal of this magnitude, could lead to a break with reality or a state of temporary insanity. The defense sought to introduce evidence of the rumored affair, not necessarily to prove its existence as fact, but to demonstrate that the information was communicated to Miller and that he believed it, thus establishing the provocation for his emotional state. The prosecution countered vehemently. They argued that aggravated murder requires intent and premeditation. They pointed to the presence of the improvised weapon in the visitation hall as clear evidence of planning. Smuggling such an item into a secure facility requires forethought and opportunity. They argued that David Miller had acquired and concealed the weapon before the visit, indicating his intention to commit violence, possibly if the conversation did not go as he wished, or if he had already decided on a course of action based on the letter. The prosecution minimized the significance of the rumor itself, portraying it as unsubstantiated gossip that did not rise to the level of legal provocation for murder. They presented evidence detailing the methodical nature of the attack, highlighting the number and placement of the stab wounds as indicative of a deliberate, furious intent to kill, rather than a chaotic act of someone losing control. Witnesses from the Northwood Correctional Facility were key to the prosecution's case. Correctional officers who were present in the visitation hall testified about the speed and brutality of the attack and the immediate aftermath. They described Miller's demeanor after being subdued, noting his lack of obvious remorse or confusion, arguing this suggested a chilling resolve rather than a bewildered state. Testimony from prison staff regarding the security protocols and the difficulty of smuggling items into the visitation area bolstered the argument for premeditation. The letter from Mark Reynolds, relaying the rumors, was presented as evidence by both sides, by the defense to show provocation, and by the prosecution to show the timing of the alleged motive relative to the apparent preparation acquiring the weapon. The truth or falsity of the affair itself remained a contentious point. While the investigation found no concrete evidence supporting the claim, the defense argued that the lack of proof did not mean the affair did not occur, only that it was successfully kept secret. The prosecution argued that the absence of evidence, despite extensive investigation, strongly indicated the rumor was unfounded. Thomas Jenkins was called to testify. His appearance on the stand was marked by visible grief and nervousness. Under oath, he again unequivocally denied any sexual relationship with Sarah. He maintained his account of a normal stepfather-stepdaughter bond, and expressed his devastation at Sarah's death and the painful public scrutiny brought upon his family by David Miller's accusation. His testimony was emotional but steadfast in its denial. Linda Thompson also testified, speaking tearfully about her daughter and her loving marriage to Thomas. She corroborated Thomas's account and expressed her heartbreak over the accusation that she believed was a lie invented by David. The courtroom proceedings became a painful public airing of private tragedy, an unfounded rumor. The defense attempted to sow doubt about the nature of the relationship between Sarah and Thomas, relying on the whispers and speculation that had circulated. The prosecution focused on David Miller's actions, weapon, and the violent outcome, arguing that regardless of the truth of the rumor, the act was murder. The fate of David Miller hinged on the jury's interpretation of his state of mind at the moment of the attack. Was he a provoked man in a state of temporary madness, or a calculating killer acting on rage, whether justified or not? The trial of David Miller was emotionally charged and complex. The prosecution methodically presented their case for aggravated murder, emphasizing the premeditation evident in the introduction of the weapon into the secured visitation area. They called witnesses from the correctional facility who described security procedures and the difficulty of bypassing them without deliberate planning. They presented the medical examiner's findings detailing the precise nature of Sarah's fatal wounds, arguing that the multiple targeted stabs were indicative of intent to kill. They downplayed the rumor of the affair, portraying it as unsubstantiated gossip and arguing that even if Sarah had been unfaithful, it did not legally justify murder. They suggested Miller's rage was disproportionate and controlling, stemming from his own insecurities and prison isolation rather than legitimate provocation. The defense focused heavily on David Miller's state of mind. They argued that the rumor of the affair, delivered via the letter just days before the visit, constituted profound emotional provocation. They presented testimony from a forensic psychologist, who explained the psychological impact of isolation, perceived betrayal, and the specific dynamics of incarceration on an individual's mental state. The psychologist testified that, in their opinion, Miller could have entered a state of extreme emotional disturbance upon believing the rumor, leading to actions he would not have otherwise taken. The defense highlighted the apparent contradiction of Miller killing the very person who supported him, arguing this irrational act was further evidence of a disturbed state. They put forth the theory that Miller may have obtained the weapon earlier for self-protection within the prison, and its use in the visitation room was a spontaneous, albeit horrific, reaction to the overwhelming information he received. The cross-examination of Thomas Jenkins by the defense was intense, though he remained steadfast in his denial of an affair. The defense attempted to highlight any instance of perceived closeness between Sarah and Thomas, relying on the vague rumors that had surfaced during the investigation. But without concrete evidence, these efforts largely failed to create significant doubt in the minds of the jury regarding Thomas's credibility. Linda Thompson's testimony, while focused on her grief in defense of her husband, underscored the immense pain this accusation and the subsequent murder had inflicted on their family. The letter from Mark Reynolds was central to the defense's argument about how Miller received the information. Reynolds himself testified, recounting how he heard the rumors, though he admitted they were not based on direct observation or proof. The defense argued that Miller had no reason to doubt the information coming from an outside source, particularly one he knew. The prosecution countered that a reasonable person would question such a rumor, especially concerning a spouse who appeared outwardly loyal, and that Miller's immediate belief and violent reaction demonstrated a predisposition to possessive rage. During closing arguments, the prosecution painted a picture of a jealous, controlling man who committed a planned, brutal act of murder, motivated by a baseless rumor or perhaps other deeper resentments. They emphasized the lack of concrete evidence for the affair, and the irrefutable evidence of the weapon in the violent attack. The defense argued that David Miller was a man driven to madness by a devastating betrayal, a victim of circumstance and rumor, whose actions were a tragic consequence of overwhelming emotion, not calculated intent. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Their decision hinged on whether they believed David Miller acted with premeditation or under extreme emotional disturbance. The legal definition of provocation and the subjective nature of extreme emotional disturbance were central to their task. They had to weigh the evidence of the planned entry of the weapon against the defense's argument that the rumor, however false, was a legitimate trigger for a psychological break in the unique context of incarceration. Ultimately, the jury found David Miller guilty of murder, a lesser charge than aggravated murder, but still a conviction for intentionally causing Sarah Miller's death. The verdict indicated that while they did not find sufficient evidence of premeditation required for aggravated murder, they also did not fully accept the defense's argument for extreme emotional disturbance as a complete defense to the killing. The finding of murder acknowledged the intent to kill, likely influenced by the means and method of the attack, while possibly reflecting some consideration of the context or the information Miller claimed to have received. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. Linda Thompson wept quietly. Thomas Jenkins sat stoically. David Miller showed little reaction, his face blank. The verdict brought a legal conclusion, but the emotional devastation and the unanswered questions surrounding the alleged secret lingered. Following his conviction for murder, David Miller returned to the custody of the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction. The sentencing phase followed. The court considered the severity of the crime, the circumstances surrounding it, Miller's criminal history, and the impact on the victim's family. Linda Thompson provided a victim impact statement, delivered with profound sorrow and quiet dignity. She spoke of Sarah's life, her kindness, her commitment, and the unbearable pain of her loss. She described the trauma inflicted not just by Sarah's death, but by the false and cruel accusation made against her husband, Thomas, which had ripped through their family in the wake of the murder. She expressed the void left in her life by her daughter's absence. Thomas Jenkins also spoke, his voice thick with emotion, reiterating the devastating impact of Sarah's death and the baselessness of the accusation against him. He spoke of losing his stepdaughter and enduring the public speculation surrounding his relationship with her, a deeply personal and painful violation. David Miller, when given the opportunity to speak, offered a brief, halting statement. He reiterated his claim that he acted out of a belief that Sarah had betrayed him. He expressed remorse for Sarah's death, but his words were intertwined with continued references to the alleged affair, suggesting that even after the trial, he remained fixated on the rumor as the cause of the tragedy. The judge listened carefully to the statements and the arguments from both the prosecution and the defense regarding the appropriate sentence. The prosecution requested a significant sentence, emphasizing the brutality of the crime and the fact that it occurred within a state facility, an environment that should be controlled and secure. The defense argued for leniency, reiterating the circumstances of the alleged provocation and Miller's psychological state. The judge ultimately sentenced David Miller to a term of 15 years to life in prison. This sentence reflected the gravity of the murder conviction while allowing for the possibility of parole after 15 years, a standard range for murder in Ohio at the time. The sentence effectively meant David Miller would likely spend the majority, if not all, of his remaining life incarcerated, now for murder instead of aggravated robbery. The prison adapted its protocols in the aftermath of the incident. Security measures in the visitation area were reviewed and potentially enhanced to prevent the introduction of contraband weapons. The incident served as a stark reminder of the challenges of maintaining security, while allowing essential connections between inmates and the outside world. The case had a lasting impact on the Northwood Correctional Facility and the correctional officers who witnessed the horrifying event. The emotional toll on staff involved in such incidents is significant, requiring counseling and support. For Linda Thompson and Thomas Jenkins, the end of the trial and sentencing did not bring closure, but rather a new phase of living with the profound grief of losing Sarah and the lingering shadow of the accusation that had been aired publicly. The community in Mansfield also grappled with the disturbing nature of the crime, a murder committed by an inmate against his visitor, a betrayal within a betrayal. The rumors surrounding Sarah and Thomas, though unproven in court, persisted in whispers, adding another layer of pain to the family's suffering. The alleged secret, whether true or false, had destroyed multiple lives. Sarah Miller was dead. David Miller was condemned to spend his life in prison. Linda and Thomas were left to navigate a future without their daughter, their family dynamics permanently scarred by the accusation and the violence. The case of Sarah Miller's murder in the prison visitation hall became a grim statistic, a cautionary tale about the destructive power of secrets, rumors, and unchecked rage, played out in the most unlikely and devastating of settings. The sterile visitation room, meant for connection across a divide, had become a tomb. The 15 years to life sentence meant David Miller was transferred from Northwood Correctional Facility to a higher security institution within the Ohio prison system to serve his term. Life within the confines of the state penitentiary continued for him, marked by the rigid routine of incarceration, the constant presence of guards, and the slow passage of time measured in decades. His appeal of the murder conviction was unsuccessful. Appellate courts upheld the trial court's finding, concluding that the evidence supported the jury's verdict, and that no significant legal errors occurred during the trial. The defense's argument regarding extreme emotional disturbance, while considered by the jury in reaching the murder verdict, rather than aggravated murder, was not deemed a basis for overturning the conviction on appeal. Inside prison, Miller reportedly became even more withdrawn. The act he committed set him apart, even in a population of convicted felons. Killing one's own visiting wife, the person who had maintained ties to the outside, was an act perceived by many inmates as particularly heinous or irrational. He served his time quietly, his name occasionally resurfacing in administrative records, but largely fading from public consciousness. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, life for Linda Thompson and Thomas Jenkins was irrevocably altered. The period immediately following the trial was one of intense grief compounded by the emotional exhaustion of the legal process. They buried Sarah, a private ceremony attended by close family and friends, a stark contrast to the public spectacle the end of her life had become. Her absence left a palpable void in their home and their lives. Family gatherings felt incomplete. Holidays were marked by sorrow. Linda struggled with the trauma of losing her only daughter so violently and the lingering pain of the accusation against her husband. Thomas, while cleared legally and supported by his wife, carried the burden of the public rumor and the knowledge that it may have directly contributed to the events of that day. He remained steadfast in his denial, but the whispers were difficult to entirely escape, particularly in a smaller community like Mansfield. Their relationship, while strong, bore the scars of the immense pressure placed upon it. The house Sarah had rented was emptied, her belongings distributed or stored, a painful task for Linda. Her workplace at the clinic held a small memorial service. Colleagues remembered her quiet dedication and gentle nature, struggling to reconcile that image with the violent circumstances of her death. The visitation room at Northwood Correctional Facility, where the murder occurred, was renovated. Table 7 was replaced, the floor repaired and cleaned, the space attempting to erase the physical evidence of the tragedy, though the memory lingered among staff and inmates. New security protocols were indeed implemented, adding layers to the visitor screening process and increasing surveillance within the visitation areas. These changes were a direct consequence of Sarah Miller's death, a physical manifestation of the institutional response to a breach of the most fundamental kind, the failure to protect a visitor within the facility's controlled environment. The broader impact of the case extended to discussions about domestic violence, even within the context of incarceration. It highlighted the fact that patterns of control and possessiveness could persist and escalate, even when partners were physically separated by prison walls. It also underscored the devastating potential of misinformation and rumor, particularly in an environment where verifying information is difficult and emotions are heightened by isolation. Years passed. David Miller, aged within the prison system, his sentence a long shadow over his existence. Linda and Thomas continued their lives, marked by grief and resilience. They found solace in each other and in the support of loyal friends and family who saw past the rumors. The legal case was closed, the sentences served, or being served, but the human story, the irreversible consequences of that single act of violence in a brightly lit sterile room, endured. The quiet life of Sarah Miller, the complex reality of David Miller's incarceration, the stability of Linda and Thomas Jenkins' marriage, all shattered by a secret, real or imagined, that traveled into a prison and became a motive for murder. The devastation was absolute, a haunting testament to the destructive power of betrayal and rage, leaving behind only absence and indelible pain.